Today's video is all about monitoring a diabetic dog or cat at home. And so moving on to the next question, which is from TB, who asks, can you talk about calibrating a human glucose meter for a dog? So I'll start off by saying, well, home monitoring of blood glucose is an excellent way to monitor insulin treatment in a diabetic dog or a diabetic cat. It's very simple to do in the vast majority of cases, not in every case, but in the vast majority. It's something that's very easy to do, and you don't get a stress effect which can cause a really high, an artificially high blood glucose level compared to having serial blood glucose levels taken at the vet. Like I say, it's generally easy, very well tolerated. We tend to take blood from the ear margin. That's generally the easiest way. So what you do is you just take a small needle and you do a little prick on the edge of the ear. That gets you a tiny little bit of blood, which is all you need to get a blood glucose level. Now, if you're struggling to get that, then you can use a warm towel held over the ear, which just causes the blood vessels to dilate and makes it more likely that you'll get some blood. And if you're finding that the blood is kind of just smearing and kind of running over into the fur and you're not really able to get enough to go into the machine, then you can actually put a very thin smear of petroleum jelly or Vaseline over the area that you'll prick, and that will cause a nice blood blob to form. A little bit of pressure, stop the bleeding. It's a really tiny amount and it's very simple, and your pet's hardly going to notice. Now, moving on to kind of human glucometers. So they aren't as accurate as pet specific ones, and that's because glucose is present in different proportions in the serum and in the red blood cells in different species, and also different species have different PCVs, so amounts of red blood cells circulating in the blood. There is quite a big difference between humans and dogs and cats. There is a small difference between dogs and cats as well, but not so much. Now, that means that ideally we're going to want to use a pet-specific glucometer. They are reasonably cheap to buy, but test strips are much more expensive than human strips. Now, that said, when we're monitoring glucose levels, blood glucose levels in our dogs and cats, we're not using those to micromanage or to change the insulin dose on a daily basis. So it's very different from kind of human diabetes management. So from that point of view, you're not going to use as many strips as a human diabetic would tend to use. So that cost difference maybe isn't so much. It's definitely something to think about, and it's going to be a long-term cost. So yeah, something to think about. It may actually work out perfectly fine for you to get a pet glucometer and use the strips that are needed for that without breaking the bank. But that said, it is okay to use a human glucometer. The way to get that calibrated so that you know exactly what the blood glucose level in your pet is to actually have your vet run a glucose curve, a blood glucose curve on your pet using their glucometer as well as yours at the same time. And that way you can compare the two readings and get an idea of the level of blood glucose that the reading on your machine would correlate to. So that's definitely something to think about doing if you're using a human glucometer. And they are fine to use. Certainly in previous practices, that's actually what we've used when we've been taking spot blood glucose measures, and then we've gone on to different equipment if we've kind of needed to for any particular reason. Also, that being said, there are other ways that we can monitor diabetes at home. Like I say, we're not wanting to micromanage insulin dose based on the blood glucose levels. And so there are other things that we can do and look out for that will give an indicator that in general, a dog or a cat is controlled to a good degree and is nice and stable with their diabetic management. So that includes keeping an eye on their weight. So are they losing weight, which would indicate that actually things aren't being controlled nicely? What's their appetite like? Are they really hungry? Again, if the diabetes is not well controlled and the blood glucose is very high, then effectively they're urinating out an awful lot of glucose and energy, and so they remain very hungry. Also, the body is effectively, the cells are kind of starved for glucose even though there's loads in the blood. So that's another thing. Amount being drunk is also a kind of a real key indicator. If all of a sudden your dog or your cat starts to drink a lot more again, then that's going to indicate that the blood glucose levels are higher and the diabetes is not as well controlled. And then also just their general demeanor. Are they happy or are they sick? A happy dog, a happy pet is unlikely to be in kind of serious dire straits with diabetic management. And if their drinking is kind of low, if they're maintaining a stable weight, then the likelihood is that their insulin dose that they're on is absolutely sufficient. Finally, we can also use urine strips to look at the glucose and also ketone levels in the urine. So If we're seeing glucose in the urine, then that means that the levels are higher than they should normally be. And if we're seeing something called ketones, then actually we know that we're about to, that the dog or a cat is really not very well controlled at all and is going to become sick very soon. So we definitely need to jump on that. So that's a very simple thing to do. You just collect a wee little urine sample, dip the strip in, and look for a colour change, which is something, that you can discuss with your vet as well. So you can definitely use a human glucometer, but there are other things as well. If, for example, your pet doesn't tolerate having their blood glucose measured, or it's not something that you're able to do for whatever reason, there are other ways that you can monitor a diabetic patient at home.
You've been watching the Dr. Alex Answers video podcast. Remember to subscribe and head over to dralexanswers.com for any links, downloads, and get your question answered.